Welcome to Ministry Untold. Is this too honest for you? Let's talk about what happens when a pastor begins to question his faith. Welcome back to Ministry Untold. My name is Wren. This is a space where we talk about the realities of ministry that leaders experience but rarely ever discuss openly. In previous episodes, we talked about burnout, and loneliness, and moral failures and vulnerabilities in ministry. But there's another reality that many pastors quietly navigate. And sometimes the tension in ministry is not what is happening in the church. Sometimes the tension that pastors deal with is what's happening inside. And so today's conversation is, again, not a theological debate. It's about the pastoral experience of navigating seasons where faith becomes more complex than it really seems. And so, to help us with that conversation today, I'm joined by fellow pastor and podcaster, Wes Via. Wes, welcome to Ministry Untold.
Thanks for having me, Wren. Excited to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you. Now, before we jump into this conversation, let's talk a little bit about Wes. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you outside of pastoring?
Well, outside of pastoring, that's a good question. Everything gets so wrapped up in it, but yeah, I'm married. Been married for going on 17 years this year. Father, I have 2 sons, and yeah, we that takes most of my most of my time. I enjoy playing pickleball. Have a hobby of videography and podcasting and media production. It's kind of a hobby, but most of my time is wrapped up in ministry. It's just kind of an all-consuming thing. Wherever you are, you're still a pastor. So everything kind of gets dovetailed into that piece of it.
Okay, now what drew you? How did you get into this thing, this ministry thing? How did you get here?
I had a call in my life from a very early age to be a preacher, and so that was always just kind of there in the back of my mind that's where I was headed. Even in my years away from the church, where I was just wanted nothing to do with God, had no spiritual inclination whatsoever at all, there would still be this kind of idea, this long-term picture, this kind of sick, twisted kind of fantasy about preaching. So it was just always there, couldn't outrun it. Once I came back to the Lord, very quickly, just, the draw towards ministry and getting involved in ministry and making that my career was very, very powerful from the very beginning.
It's beautiful. So, what part of ministry do you enjoy the most, and what part do you enjoy the absolute least?
Yeah, it's funny because, like I said, the call was to preaching, and then when I came into ministry, I came through Bible working and doing public evangelism as kind of the starting place, and then got into conference work. Doing different things at the conference, and I have a natural gift and kind of inclination towards administration and systems, and so I find myself getting involved in that type of stuff. And I got to the place where it was like I really wasn't that interested in preaching, and then I thought, well, I'd really love to just be in a situation where I could be on staff, an associate, just kind of do the relational pastoral stuff, the administrative pastoral stuff, and leave the preaching to somebody else. And then while I was pastoring, once I finally started pastoring, that was kind of where I came in. I wasn't real keen on preaching, even as I was beginning pastoral ministry. But then through the course of that, through the course of my own, personal, journey through, deconstruction and reconstruction, got to a place where I really fell in love with preaching. And so now that I am finally in that situation where I'm in a large church, I'm on staff, I'm the executive pastor, and I don't preach that often, I find myself really missing, really missing preaching. And so I've come full circle all the way around.
Yes, that's interesting. What's your go-to passage for a sermon? You're called last minute to preach. What's your go-to?
Um, well, I don't have a particular passage that I would go to. I think I would gravitate towards Second Corinthians chapter 5, verses 17 through 21, maybe all the way back to, I think, 14 through 21. Would be that's kind of the central gospel text for me in my thinking. Everything kind of ties back to that is, I think, the clearest declaration of the gospel and its application in our life and how we apply it. But the thing that I have come to, there's a thing that Eugene Peterson was told by his son. Actually, he shares this in his memoir that every pastor has one sermon, and you need to figure out what is your one sermon. And his son said, your ministry has been rich because you've always known what your one sermon was. And so for me, the one thing that is going to come through in every sermon, and if I have to just start somewhere, I'm going to talk about the reality of what Christ has accomplished for us, who we are in Christ, and what our relationship is to Him as Son, as redeemed, and what our relationship is to sin, which is dead to and free from it. So that's going to be the thing that I'm going to focus on if I'm called on in a spot. And
Yeah.
pretty much every sermon I preach goes back to that at some point. I start to feel like a broken record, but that is, I believe, the central theme.
Love it, love it. What's the weirdest? What's the? We're gonna jump into deconstruction in a while, but
Uh-huh.
what's the weirdest parenting lesson that you've learned? What's the weirdest lesson you've learned so far?
The weirdest lesson that I've learned.
Hmm.
So, the weirdest thing that parenting has taught me is not really about parenting my child, although it applies, but it is learning about how to parent my child, especially my young children. Pre-verbal, trying to set expectations, how to actually get them to demonstrate the behavior that I'm looking for. Child psychology, basically. How do you get your kid to cooperate with you? That has paid massive dividends in my pastoral ministry. And I can say this kind of jokingly, but also true, that the reality is that most adults are just acting out their childhood, pain. And so I have found a lot of success in, especially with particularly difficult members who are argumentative or are constantly causing problems, that viewing them as I would view my son, right? Not viewing them as a little child, but viewing them as I view my little child, with that love and that compassion and that understanding that there's something more that maybe they can't communicate to me. And how would I address that with my child, and then applying those principles to these difficult individuals. I have found that to be a recipe for great success in building relationships, helping people kind of move past that cantankerous spirit, and to come to a place where they're more in harmony with the body, willing to take responsibility for their actions, and heal and become productive parts of the body. So that's probably the weirdest part of parenting and its application to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. We're all adults living out our
Mhm.
childhood experience. Love it. Yeah. So let's talk about deconstruction. First of all,
Mhm.
so I was doing some research, found out the term itself is relatively new,
Mhm.
and there seems to be so many variations and nuances as far as definition is
Mhm.
concerned. But let's talk about deconstruction from your understanding, from your perspective. What is deconstruction? What's that?
Yeah, well, I didn't know what deconstruction was until someone levied it at me as a kind of criticism. The first podcast that I did was called the Wes Via podcast, and I had I had finished my undergraduate degree, and I didn't get a call to pastoral ministry, and we had moved to Washington, and I had started a master's program on organizational leadership, and so as a response to that, I just was interested in podcasting for some reason. I'm not even really sure why it caught my attention, but it did. And so I decided I was going to start this podcast as part of my capstone for that master's around leadership, and wanted to really invest myself into the leadership conversation within Adventism, which at the time was not very strongly talked about, this idea of leadership and pastoral leadership. And it's grown now, thankfully. But so I started this podcast, and it was conversations around leadership, theology, and creativity. And it was just a listening podcast. Think Joe Rogan or any kind of the long form, just bring a guest on, talk to them about their experience, but specifically looking at pastors, creatives. I had my barber on. I had some friends who are musicians, rappers, and just hearing from them and just talking about things from their perspective. And someone got in the reviews on iTunes and called me a deconstructionist. Like, that was like, I was like, what even is it? So I had to go Google it. and once I saw the definition, which I can't remember what the definition was I found, but essentially it is someone who has undertakes a intentional path of questioning, suppositions, kind of questioning long held beliefs, and kind of taking them apart and looking at them critically. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. I didn't know that. So that was in 2018. In 2010, I had a crisis of faith, and I went through. That's when I really deconstructed personally. I thought I had everything worked out. I thought I knew where God was leading me. We had a plan for ministry and what we were going to do. And as soon as we made that plan, like, everything fell apart, and we ended up just moving back home. My wife and I, we'd only been married for maybe 6 months, 7 months at that point. We just moved back to where we had met in Louisiana. And I went through a period of doubt. I almost walked away from faith. I almost walked away from my marriage. Like, it was just crushing to me. And I sat there in that experience, and God showed up, and I was like, all right, I'm going to start over. Like, I was raised Adventist. I always just kind of took what we believe for granted. I came back to the church and immediately became very zealous for our doctrine and our church and our identity, and then that was not reciprocated in the circles that I was in. And so I was like, I'm going to start over. I know that God is real. I believe that scripture is trustworthy. I'm going to start there. I'm going to start in Genesis, and I'm going to go through the Bible. I'm going to rebuild my faith. And if there's something that I believe that I can't justify in scripture, I'm going to, stop believing that. I stopped praying at that time. I stopped praying, wrote prayers. I stopped praying for my food. I just decided, like, I was only going to say to God things that were authentic and true to me. What was in my heart. I wasn't going to worry about appearances. I was going to just put it out there. And if there was something that I didn't feel like was necessary, and I stopped doing it, but then I decided that it was necessary, like, I had to wrestle through that. Like, why am I doing the things that I'm doing? Why am I believing the things that I'm believing? And kind of took the approach that if truth is truth, it can stand up to scrutiny. And so that was the journey for me. Back many years ago, that kind of started the whole thing for me. And then 8 years later, I get called a deconstructionist. So I was like, yeah, that checks out. that's pretty much what I've been doing. So yeah, I mean, that's how I understand it. It is a questioning of the assumptions that we're given, specifically around faith, but you can deconstruct in any myriad of different contexts. But obviously in the church, we're real concerned about the fact that we're deconstructing our faith, we're deconstructing our beliefs. What's not often talked about is the reconstruction process. And I think that, someone who is willing to deconstruct is probably honestly a pretty spiritual person. And that reconstruction piece isn't talked about enough, of what they're actually doing on the other side of their questioning. But we can maybe get to that down the road if we need to.
Yeah. So I found this. I was watching this podcast. Shout out to Leaders Church, and they were kind of talking about this whole deconstruction, and they kind of use the analogy of when we deconstruct something, we're pulling it apart. We're essentially taking it apart, tearing it down,
Mhm.
and so at the core of deconstruction is you have a whole pie, but you're taking all the ingredients in the pie separately to see
Mm-hmm.
if they actually make sense as an addition to the pie,
Mm-hmm.
or if they're just there because somebody felt like putting them there, but they really don't serve any purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of that is to really test where there is value. But I came across this, and this was kind of very interesting to me. I came across this article that talks about there are three groups of people. When we talk about deconstruction, there are really three groups of people. There is the doubting; those are the individuals who are trying to figure out, okay, um, yeah, I believe, but I'm not really sure. I've got questions. I'm not really understanding everything, but at their core, they believe. And then there's another group that they're called the delusioned. The delusion. They're those who their concept is that everything is kind of constructed around cultural wars and stuff like that. They're just kind of trying to figure out how the whole system makes sense. And then there is that third group that they call the deconstructionists. They're those who they've moved away from the concept of the organized religion, organized belief or believing, whichever, and they're now more leading more towards a kind of a secular approach where they're trying to they're basically asking questions of everything that exists with the idea behind it that there is an amount of individualism that is associated with our existence within this realm as well as our existence within any kind of spiritual realm. I kind of found that very, very interesting because I myself was very new to the concept of deconstruction, right? And so what you talk about, you had a period where you're trying to figure out, okay, what's going on? I'm not sure what I believe. I'm not sure if I believe anything. I'm gonna try to rebuild this thing back. When you look back over your period of searching, do you know exactly what it is you are searching for or what it is you are trying to achieve in this process of, let's just call it confusion, if you will?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, like, listening to those three breakdowns, and as I listen to the rhetoric around deconstruction as a whole, most of the rhetoric is coming from churches who are trying to maintain their control over their constituents. um, and so that kind of colors the way that we're going to look at that, because the reality is that once you stop saying, I'm just going to believe this because my church tells me to believe this, or my pastor tells me to believe this, it does cause difficulties in the polity and the makeup of the church, because there's a lot of things that happen within a church context that are just by unspoken social agreement around a common belief. And so when someone starts to question those things and kind of come to their own conclusions about them, that is unsettling to the church. I wrestle with this as a pastor, between how I pastor people and also the need to be faithful to maintain the continuity of the local church that I serve. And how do I navigate uh, walking with someone who needs to go through this process of taking ownership of their faith. And I would say that it's more that it's less about it's less about trying to break free of the shackles of the oppression of organized religion, or however you want to phrase it, even though there's a part of that. But really, at the core, kind of going back to what I was saying about dealing with difficult church members and assuming the good about them, and assuming that rather than them intentionally trying to be one way, that they're unintentionally trying to deal with something that they can't quite put their finger on. I think that when you step back and you look at this and say, okay, if someone is questioning, someone is deconstructing, that's someone who's trying to take ownership of their faith. They're not willing to overlook answers for the sake of just getting along. Like, they want to be able to give an answer, to give an account, to give a reason for the faith that they have. Right. And so what this deconstruction is a natural part of human development. It's something that I think that we don't really recognize this in the modern context too much around, like, child development and adolescent development into adulthood, that those teenage years are not meant to be this controlled kind of, like, where a lot of parents think, like, I just got to do everything I can to keep my kids on the path, right? And I restrict them and I put my thumb on them and I put the guardrails in and I keep them busy and I don't let them think for themselves. And then they get to college where they're completely out from underneath their parents' control, and they immediately spin off into craziness. Because they were not allowed to go through a natural development. What I believe is supposed to be happening in that time is that in our early years, we're developing a relationship with our children that lets them know that we are trustworthy, that we love them, that we're safe, that we've helped them, and given them the tools to ask important questions and to make decisions for themselves, to think through things. And then in those adolescent years, when they're coming into adulthood, especially while they're still in the home, that's a time for us to give them the freedom, measured, right? Like we measure that out, and we walk with them as best we can to let them figure this out while they're in the home with us, while they're under our influence, so that then when they do step out of the home and they have to really take that next step into, okay, who am I going to be? They've already kind of dealt with some of the harder questions. And I think the church is by and large, by kind of coming at it with, like, oh, this is creating confusion, this is a bad thing, these are people who are doubting, they're just pushing back against this, this liberal idea of you make your own truth and all this stuff. Like, that is missing the opportunity that we have as a church, as pastors, as fellow Christians, to journey with someone through that period of deconstruction.
Yeah,
If that
and
makes sense.
and I imagine that with the rise of social media, it makes it increasingly more difficult to avoid issues
Mm-hmm.
of faith and spirituality, if you will, because they're just a plethora of a myriad of ideas and thoughts that float around the social wave. That's so because I saw this, man, and I was kind of very interested in this, that there is Lifeway Research. They have this little research that says pastors between ages 18 and 40, they say that they have experienced to some degree. I don't remember what the percentage is, but they've experienced to some degree uh having to deal with deconstruction in their church, within their parishioners. And then pastors who are educated at the doctoral level, they've had to deal with it. But the middle passage between that age 40 and those who are older as pastors, the research said that they said, hey, we've never really had to experience that. And I'm kind of thinking about it in myself, and maybe somebody need to do some research on that. The correlation between you know, topics surrounding deconstruction and the younger generation of people that exist within our church. Because I
Mm-hmm.
reckon that there has to be some kind of link, you know what I mean, between
Yeah.
those who are in our church or those who are not in our church and concepts or topics of deconstruction. But I kind of want to stay here, but I kind of want to pivot just a bit to look at, since we're in the church context, not just the members, but look at also the pastor. Because
Mm-hmm.
again, based on my experience, I'm looking at it and I'm like, okay, almost every pastor I know, whether younger or older in between, when you talk to them, they'll tell you, when I started out, I was going to change the world. I was
Mm-hmm.
convicted about what God has called me to preach. I'm convicted about all of that. But then over time, you know, the experiences that we have as pastors, it changes. It changes how we view ministry, changes how we view God, it changes how we view the Bible and that kind of thing. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
now wondering to myself, deconstruction within the context of the pastor is a little bit more complicated because you're dealing with personal faith. You're trying to figure this thing
Mhm.
out for yourself, while at the same time you're trying to navigate with maturity, of course, the spiritual responsibility of leading other people, and not
Mhm.
allowing your personal questions of faith to mess with somebody else's journey. And I'm kind of wondering to myself, how does a pastor balance the ship, for lack of a better term, uh, uh, between his personal questions of faith, and while leading, a church of
Mhm.
people who are trying to find their own faith? How do you think?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that you know, hope that is seen is not hope.
Mm,
Faith that is achieved is not faith. So the idea that faith is certain is not a biblical idea.
hmm.
So if you think about Hebrews chapter 11, right, verse 1, faith is the substance of things hoped for, it's the evidence of things not seen,
Right.
right? So when we're talking about questions, and we're talking about faith, and we're talking about doubt, there cannot be faith if there is not doubt. It cannot be, right? So we need to mystify, kind of destigmatize the idea that doubt is unwelcome at any capacity in the life of a believer or in the life of a pastor. That questions, if you're not asking good questions, then you aren't learning anything, right? So if you want to be a lifelong learner, and you want to be a pastor who can be effective in the long term, you have to be willing to ask hard questions, because otherwise you
Hmm.
will never learn useful things. And I think that that's probably the biggest challenge. And I think that I wrestle with this when I talk to old hats, older generation. I like to call them the Platinum Club,
Hmm.
about their faith. My grandparents, right? They were much more able to just take things as they were and not ask questions. And I think that has to do with availability of information. If you and you can kind of track this back, you look at the Dark Ages, what was going on. Science was moving forward, and the church was trying to crush the science, because the science, they thought, was going to create doubts around God's existence. And so you have the church, trying to put down Galileo and Newton, all these different people that are coming out, and the church is like, saying, no, you can't believe this, right? But as information has become more available to the common person, as literacy has increased, as the ability for the average person to study into deep things, and that is only exponentially increasing now, in both healthy and unhealthy ways, with social media and the availability of the internet. That's why these questions are happening more in the millennial, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, demographic, more so than the boomers and the Gen Xers, because they just, they were raised in a different time. And I don't know how to really square that. And I don't think that's the point of our conversation here. But so for me, in like a pastoral context, I'm always asking questions. I'm always wrestling with doubt. I'm always facing issues in my life that I'm like, wait a minute, if this is true, then how does this align with what I believe about God and God's character and who He is, and if this is true, what does this mean about the church? And I'm constantly wrestling with those questions, and some of them I've gotten answers to, some of them I don't. But but when I come to that point where it's okay, I have to minister now to someone, then I have to move by faith, right? I have done the work to um, be pretty clear on what it is that I believe. I've done the work to reconcile where I stand with the doctrines of the church, to be able to say that I affirm the doctrines of the church, even though, if I'm being honest, I probably wouldn't align with the popular consensus of the average church member, what they think some of the doctrines are. But for the most part, when I look at the statement of our beliefs, I can reconcile my beliefs with what we actually, like, our theologians have said we believe, which is different from the popular understanding. And those are the kind of
Right.
things that really that tie into this. And I think that as you become a pastor, if you're being intellectually honest, if you are being academically, prepared, that you begin to ask these questions. So it looks as though the more educated you become, the more liberal you become. But I think it's more so that the more educated you become, the more competent you are to ask the more difficult questions. that to the layperson or to the person who's unwilling to ask questions, maybe generationally or for whatever reason, it looks like this negative thing that you're going through. So there's like a lot of accusations that get thrown at pastors because they're not holding to the truth, and all this stuff. But it's really about, and for me, how I've embodied this is I bring my congregants on the journey with me. Like
Mm-hmm.
I don't obviously put my biggest questions out there. Like here's a question that I don't have an answer for, so let me give it to you with no answer. Like that's not what I do. But as I'm processing through, as I'm reckoning with and wrestling with difficult questions, and I find hope, I find a foothold of faith. That's what I preach. And so then I'm actually speaking to the questions that people are having, and this is a very different approach than many pastors take. But I let people into the journey with me, and I have church members that come up to me and they go, we're so grateful, for how you preach and how you let us in, but we're also very concerned for you that someone from the outside will come and hear you and attack you for being so vulnerable with us. And I was like, well, I'm not willing to put up a facade to pretend like I've got everything figured out when I don't. I'm not willing to put up a wall and say, I'm the pastor and I've got it all figured out. I believe that a pastor is not anything more special in terms of status than any other member of the church that they're part of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I try to lead that way, that like I have a role to fill as a leader in the church, but my job title as pastor, my calling to pastoral ministry, does not make me quantitatively or qualitatively superior to anyone else, right? So why should I not just be there with them? And that's how I do that. That's how I embody that. That's how I hold on to my humility in leadership, is by letting people see as much of me as I am comfortable doing that will not undermine their faith, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I do ask hard questions sometimes, and so, but I try to be as authentic as possible, let people in, and I see that, I have people come to me because of that. They'll come to me and ask me the hard questions. They'll come to me when they're wrestling with deconstruction, and they either through seeing my stuff on social media or being in my church, and then they're willing to let me in and say, hey, I'm really having a hard time believing this.
Right.
And then I get to speak into that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, but I imagine, because based on what I'm seeing, and for anybody watching this, we want to be very clear that, in balancing the scale in terms of the conversation, there is also a very, questionable side to the concept or the conversation of deconstruction.
mhm,
But I think the scales are balanced by first, identifying and defining what the underlying reason or motive or motivation for the whole deconstruction process. If it is just for the sake of, okay, tearing down, then that's a conversation to be had. But then the other side is, if it's on the premise of tearing down so I can understand and build back up, then that's also a conversation to be had. So for
mhm,
anybody watching, we want to ensure that you have that understanding that there obviously two sides to every coin. Now, I remember when I was at undergrad, just started out first year, for I think it was probably my first semester actually, and I had a professor, and dude said, okay, there are three things that you're gonna do while you're in college. You're gonna come here to learn, you're gonna come here to unlearn, and you're gonna come here to relearn some stuff, right? And in my head, I'm like, this guy, he's off the hinges. He's pretty
mhm,
crazy. What are you talking about? The church that we came from laid the foundation. We're just coming here to learn new stuff. But over time, you realize that, okay, yeah, as young theologians, you find yourself in a position where you're questioning everything, you're asking, you're trying to figure out. And so I kind of came to the conclusion that, any belief that you have, if you can't strip it down and build it back up, then you probably shouldn't have it. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't have any footing to stand on. And I'm going somewhere with this. I had this other professor who, I think we took this course. It might have been development of SDA theology. I think that probably
Mm-hmm.
one of them course. And dude was telling us that for 12 years, he never preached about the sanctuary at all. Right?
Yeah.
I'm like, how do you not preach about the sanctuary as an Adventist pastor? Like it is one of our core beliefs. How do you not, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And then I had another professor, he had a different guess thought process. His thought process was from the perspective of stewardship. If you are paid by the faithful tithe of the members, then you are obligated, as it were, to preach what your church teaches. Where does the pastor now find that balance between, you know, teaching what the church teaches, but also having that personal and intellectual integrity to say, hey, I'm not sure where I stand where this is concerned. How do you find that balance?
um, yeah, I I had a member that didn't believe, in several of the doctrines, sanctuary, spirit of prophecy. Um, and and so when I would let him preach, sometimes he would go off and start saying all this stuff. and just calling it out. And I finally told him, I was like, listen, I can't allow you to preach. I
Hmm.
was like, and shouldn't you shouldn't be comfortable. You shouldn't think it's your place. If you're going to stand up and speak to a room, like there's a myriad of other things to speak about. Speak about something
Right.
you agree upon, not something you disagree upon. Um, and so, for me, when I am uncomfortable with something, or if I'm personally questioning it, or if you know, yeah, let's leave it at that. Like, I'm just not going to preach on that, right?
Hmm.
I don't believe that that we have an obligation simply because we work for the church, that like somehow we're supposed to just cycle the same 28 sermons over and over and over so that we get
Hmm.
all the doctrines right. Some things are more useful and helpful than other things. And so, and in the context of Sabbath morning preaching, where I'm being pastoral, not evangelistic, and this is a big
Hmm.
issue that came out of my deconstruction, which is that within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we have a terrible theology of pastoral ministry, because we have folded in to every aspect of paid employment in the Adventist Church the idea that you are an evangelist. But
Mm.
Scripture tells us that being an evangelist is a particular ministry that some are called to,
Yeah,
right?
spiritual gift. Hmm.
And so it is a gift given by the Spirit of God. It is not a fruit of the Spirit, and by which everyone has it, right?
Hmm.
And so this idea that to be faithfully preaching the Adventist message, you have to be preaching the the 28 or 30 evangelistic sermons over and over and over, or at least go through them every once in a while. That's just a wrong way of thinking, right? I was asked by my conference president a few years back. There was some questions about my theology, and he asked me, when was the last time I preached on the sanctuary? And I was like, well, I include connections to the sanctuary in every single sermon series that I preach. I was like, but if you're asking me when was the last time I preached a evangelistic sermon on the sanctuary, I never have and I never will. Like,
Hmm.
I'm called to pastoral ministry. I'm called to shepherd my church, and I'm not trying to intellectually convince someone of what is right or true about the sanctuary. I'm trying to help my congregation understand how the gospel, in the context of relationships, in the context of seasons of life, in the context of conflict, whatever the context is of my sermon series that I'm currently preaching on, I'm trying to lay the foundation for how the gospel speaks into this part of their life, and then make the connections to how then the gospel and this aspect of our life then connect to, and how the doctrines help us have greater light and information, like help, not information, but inform how we go through these challenges, whether it's sickness or whatever, that because of the gospel, this is true. And then when we look at it through the lens of what we believe about hell, what we believe about the sanctuary, what we believe about the spirit of prophecy, what we believe about these things, that enriches the gospel in the context of that, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think we have made a bunch of spiritual idiots of our members. And I say that aggressively because I want someone to stop and listen to what I'm about to say.
Mm.
Um, by this idea that we have to continually repeat and regurgitate and go back and eat at the same table of the same 28 things over and
Mm-hmm.
over and over again, that every time we have an evangelistic series, every member needs to come, every Bible study that's given needs to focus on those things. It constricts the perspective of the average person to be like, well, this is all there is to scripture. And this is one of the fundamental, like, going back to the beginning of my deconstruction, I got to the place where I could not read scripture and get anything out of it, because I only had a doctrinal lens.
Mm.
I only had the lens of how I'm reading scripture, and scripture is to prove that what I believe, the doctrines I believe, are true. And if everyone would believe the doctrines that I believe, then everything would be better. And so when I was reading scripture, it got to a point after several years that it's like, okay, all right, well, that's that doctrine, that's that doctrine, that's that doctrine. And I was like, okay, well, I can keep reading this and I can keep seeing those doctrines, but I already know that. I
Mm.
can't see anything else. And so that was a key part for me of saying, okay, why I had made that decision to say, I'm going to start over, and I'm going to see what actually comes out of the text itself. Right.
Right.
I had to do that to break free of that lens. And so our kind of cultural MO has kind of created that for a lot of people, that we're just kind of stuck, and we think like, oh, well, I believe these things, so I'm good. But we don't know how to apply it to our life. We're still hateful people, spiteful people, unhappy people, depressed, prone to gossip. We're seeing no real transformation in our character, like the surface level character. But we can tell you about the 2300 days, and that's a problem, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm laughing, man, because there's somebody watching right now who's if they haven't said it or put it in the chat, somebody is thinking it. You need dogmas. You can't get past having dogmas if you're gonna
uh-huh.
run a church and if you're gonna have any belief system. And I'm kind of looking at this now. There was and I guess it was well intentioned when our parents used to say, "Don't question God.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever God says, just do. Don't ask any
Yeah.
question." You know, there's just kind of the idea that take it and run with it, you know
Mm-hmm.
and I find that to be very problematic. I find that to be very problematic, especially when you talk about pastoral ministry. You talk to pastors, and you listen to the reason and the rationale, the way they present what they believe, and you're like, dude,
Mm-hmm.
all that you're giving me really is the same thing that we read in Sabbath school lesson, or the
Yep.
same thing that we like. Do you actually have you widened your scope of how this works and why you
Mm-hmm.
believe it, if you actually believe it? Because I've come across a couple of pastors, man, who will tell you, dude, yeah, I don't know. I'm just teaching what the church teaches. And for
Mm-hmm.
me, I have a major problem with that. I have a major
Right.
problem with that because I think you're being disingenuous if you're
Mm-hmm.
just there to teach what the church teaches, because
Yep.
there is an amount of personal integrity, I believe, at least, that is associated with preaching and teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And at least the way I look at it is that before God preaches to people, he teaches the teacher or the preacher to get him to the point of him or her to the point of conviction, so that he can use that conviction to lead other people. So I'm
Mhm.
kind of thinking about that within context of somebody who said, but we need the dogmas. How do you rationalize
Mhm.
deconstructing when that process might even, uproot a couple of the dogmas or challenge them?
Mhm.
How do you do that?
Yeah. Um, I have a document. I won't pull it up and get all crazy with it right now, but it's several pages long of quotes from Ellen White talking about that we will have to let go of some cherished beliefs. That
Mm,
just because we have for a long time considered our, and she uses words like doctrine,
hmm
that there will be light that we will have to let go of, right? These terms that she used for, our teaching, right? Not interesting Bible facts, but like core central things, where she says repeatedly, in different ways, in different contexts, that there's going to be things that have to be understood differently in the future than how we understand them right now.
hmm
And and so that is a challenge. Like I feel that I wrestle with that all the time, because I do believe, like I said, the first thing that the first responsibility I have as a minister of the gospel, as a follower of Jesus Christ, is to carry the message to the world that in Christ, by faith, you have been set free from sin, you have been made alive to Christ, that you are filled with the Holy Spirit, you have been set apart, sanctified, and have been called to, an inheritance in Jesus Christ. This is who we are, and this is how we live.
hmm
And so with that comes, like, you don't need to know any doctrine to believe that and to receive that life. You don't need to keep the Sabbath to believe that and to receive that light. You don't need any of the doctrine to get there. And so the struggle that I see, and I see this in what I think many people within the Adventist context would look at and go, oh, they deconstructed and look, they left the church, is that as people in my generation, and especially younger Gen Z, they go through this process and they discover the gospel, and they uncover a relationship with Jesus that is vibrant and dynamic, where God is speaking to them and guiding them and enriching their life. And then they don't see how the things that they were taught to believe as they were growing up actually help them in that. I was talking to a young adult uh, a couple months ago, and they go to a state university, and they came to me, and we were talking, and I was talking about, the way I talk about things, and so they felt like they could come and talk to me, and they said, I'm really struggling because all my life I grew up in this church, and I learned all of our doctrine, I believe all of our doctrine, but then when my friends ask me why I believe what I believe, I'm struggling to come up with a reason why they need to believe it, because when I look at them, their life with God is so rich and so vibrant, and their hunger for him, and they're thirsting for him, and they're sacrificing in ways that I don't see people sacrificing in my church. And then she said, it has always been the case in my life that I came to the Adventist church and I was taught doctrine, but it was when I went to church on Sunday that I learned how to be a Christian.
hmm
And so this disconnect between knowing the right doctrine and actually living a life, like, that becomes challenging when
Right.
our structure is built around, we have to agree, we have to intellectually assent to all of these things in order to be together. And then you're like, but I also want you to be a good Christian who knows Christ and is led by him and receives that metanoia, that transformation, right,
hmm
from to become like Christ. And you're not going to do that simply by knowing, the intellectual, truth of our doctrine. You're going to have an experience with God. As I try to lead people there, that is a concern that I have, that people will become less concerned about maintaining doctrine. And it's like, that's the tensions there for me as a pastor, because I work for the church, and I'm a Seventh Day Adventist. I affirm my theology that I've received from the Seventh Day Adventist Church, but uh, I also believe that God is capable to hold His church together.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I have just, it's been affirmed to me over and over and over again, in my ministry and and seeing the fruit of ministry and what the Spirit does, as I seek to be faithful, that God has got this. And so it's very unsettling. It's very,
Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah.
very hard to run a church when I'm not willing to leverage, tithing pressure onto people, when I'm not willing to leverage Sabbath observance onto people. Like if they have to come to that on their own, if they're not coming to it
Mm-hmm.
on their own, then, and they're just doing it out of compulsion, then they're not doing it in a way. And I think that's why many people, like, they pull away, because it's like, when I come to church, I have to put on airs to make sure that I look the part and act the part and talk the part, but then I know that I'm not actually there, but there's no safe place for me to process that. And so I don't actually want to be around those people, because I don't want to get caught out. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that that's a big part of why we see such a gap in our churches, is because we haven't created a space for people to ask honest questions. What I've
Mm-hmm.
seen in my short time in pastoral ministry, um, is that in every district that I've been in, as I create that space and people realize that it is a safe place, that I'm not the same type of pastor that they've had before, that people who were on the margins and not attending will still be on the margins, but they'll start attending,
Mm-hmm.
because they actually do have a desire for spiritual things. It's just that they didn't feel like they could actually ask the questions they needed to ask. They didn't feel like they could be who they were while they were searching for those answers. I have a number of people that follow me online from my past, that are living alternative lifestyles, that on the surface they're witches, and they're you name it, all kinds of different things, drug addicts, alcoholics, but they're engaging with my content, they're messaging me, they're thanking me for sharing things, like they have a hunger for spiritual things still, but yet they find no place for them in the church, because there's not a place for them to be able to ask those questions safely in a church. Because as
Mm-hmm.
soon as you get into that church context, there's this pressure to conform,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's not an easy road. I wish it was much
Yeah.
easier than it is.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's just about creating that space, for people to encounter God, for them to see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. How do we do
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, it's a very good question of how do we do that, and I think that's where now the localized church has to kind of look at itself and say, okay, here's where we are, here's what our community needs, as far as teaching, and this is how we can approach that. I used to, I think one of the things I enjoy most, second to preaching. The next thing that I enjoy most is Bible study. I really do, because in Bible study now you get to really hear, you get to really ask, and you get to really sit down and wrestle with some things. Right now, we're doing in our church, we have what we call the Quest Bible study, where we're discovering God within the 28 fundamental beliefs. We're not
Mhm.
trying to have you just, recite them for what they're written on the church's website, but we really want to find God in the midst of it, so that when somebody has asked you about it, you're convicted that, hey, yeah,
Mhm.
here is God in it, and this is why I believe what I believe, whatever. But I'm kind of looking at him, and I was like, okay, could it be that, and again, context of pastors, could it be that we are afraid of engaging? And I kind of want to, insert this word. You can, push back, or we can talk about it. Healthy deconstruction, because I really believe that there's unhealthy deconstruction, guided by whatever the motive is. Could it
Mhm.
be that some pastors, even though they have questions, are afraid of what the blowback and the pushback might be, both from their members as well as from their employer, should they engage
Mm.
in a healthy deconstruction process? And that might be one of the reasons you see some pastors just say, hey, I'm just going to teach everything that church teaches without asking any question. Do you think that it could
Mm-hmm.
just be a case of, yeah, I got to keep my job. I got to ensure that I
Mm-hmm.
stay on the right side of history so that
Yep.
this doesn't affect me or affect my family or whatever? You think it could
Yep.
be something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also the church response. So I don't believe that there is unhealthy deconstruction
Mm,
when it's actuated by the individual.
okay.
You know, you go through those different reasons why someone might deconstruct or whatever. A person who's properly deconstructing, not someone who just like casts off their beliefs and goes and runs wild, right? That's a person in a crisis of faith. But a spiritual person who's asking difficult questions and not just accepting stock answers is oftentimes kind of demonized as like their reasons are questioned. Well, are you just being a
Hmm.
doubting person? Are you wrestling with these constructs of these social constructs and relativistic truth, or are you actually seeking to get to the nitty gritty of this? I can't tell that about you, right? I
Hmm.
can't see your heart, and I've gone through questioning and still do from all of those. Sometimes it's just straight up a doubt, right? Sometimes it's because I come face to face with social constructs that I see placed in the church, that then cause me to question, okay, well, we uphold this social construct because of this certain thing. So if I can just call it out, I was visiting with someone from the general conference. I won't say names, but they travel the world, and they went to uh, Pol- Polynesia, kind of down somewhere outside of Australia, South Pacific, and
Hmm.
they were on an island. It was like 102 degrees, and they were wearing what everyone else was wearing to church, which was kind of one of those like Hawaiian style shirts, and khakis. And they were supposed to preach, and they got there and they said, oh, you can't go on the platform like that, you have to wear a suit,
Right.
right? And there's nothing holy about a suit and tie, right? that
Right.
that is
Right. Right.
100% social colonialism. Like that's
Hmm.
that's what that is. It tells them that you're not holy if you're not wearing a suit on the platform, right?
Right.
So
Right.
that kind of stuff, right? Just to give an easy example, like all of that comes in. You can't actually judge why someone's doing, like why they're asking the questions that they're asking. And then but what I see happen is, because people want to make a value judgment on why someone's asking the question, that then they push people into unhealthy deconstruction. Because
Hmm.
where you have, and there was a big a big name person recently who publicly has gone through this deconstruction. And if you listen to their first comments when they were stepping away from the church, and what they were saying about the questions that they had and the beliefs that they were questioning, when they just came out and said, this is where I'm at, this is why you haven't seen me, this is why this is going on. Like, they were not like antagonistic, like all this is wrong and blah blah blah. They were just like, here's a couple things that I can't reconcile. And so situation unfolded. When you look at the response and how
Hmm.
people treated them in response to that, and
Of
now you
course.
listen to them, they're on the full offensive to destroy Adventism,
Hmm.
right? Like, they're
Hmm.
questioning everything. I have a friend, a pastor, who same thing. He came to uh, a conclusion about the Sabbath as the seal, and what the seal of God was, and took a huge stand on it, and he got to do what he wanted to do. But then the response to his comments, and his theology actually wasn't that off. Like, he was raising legitimate questions, and there's a group of pastors online, and even some of them, as it became public, were like, why is this guy getting all worked up? If that's what he believes, that's that's what we believe. Like, why is he getting so worked up? But to him, it was this thing. The response then pushed him to where now he's just vehemently, like, his whole life seems to be consumed with attacking
Right.
Trav in his church.
Mm.
And I've told him, like, dude, like, why are you doing this? And it's that hurt, it's that response, you know, it's that pushback.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
see that over and over again, and not just in Adventism, but when you look at, I think it's John. I don't want to call names, but there's one major Reformed pastor whose son on TikTok has like millions and millions of followers, right?
Mm.
But again, it's the pushback of he came out and then he gets all this hate, and it pushes you further and further down the path, right? And so when deconstruction becomes unhealthy, I think it is that unhealthy place comes from and is laid at the feet of Christians who are unloving and unconcerned with that person as an individual. They're only concerned with what it might say about them if they
Mm-hmm.
don't push back. And I think that's, if we wanted to bring this down and try to make this very practical, as okay, how do we deal with deconstruction, either as a pastor or as a church?
Mm.
It's to honor the individuality and the sincerity of the person who is going through it. And the best way we can do that is to ask ourselves this question: what does it say about me if this person believes this? A person can come in and they can be, living how they want to live. They can be living an alternative lifestyle. They can be, struggling with drugs and alcohol. They can be questioning beliefs. They can be, adamantly opposed to some of our doctrine. What does it say about me? What does it say about us as a church if we allow that person to be part of us, to be around us, to be in community with us? Most of the time, we're concerned about what that person's reputation will say about us to other people like us. And so therefore we push that person away, and we take some personal responsibility that if I allow that person to be around me and believe that way or act that way or dress that way or talk that way or whatever, like that somehow then I'm going to get in trouble. People are going to think less of me. And so then I feel a responsibility. And that's not untrue. Like that, as a pastor, this, right? That like if you get too close to people, like church members will come, oh, pastor, you shouldn't be, hanging out with people like that. And the same thing said about Jesus, right? You're a drunk because you're hanging out with the drunks. Jesus,
Right.
Yeah. Sick people are the ones who need a doctor. Healthy people are good.
Right.
I'm going to go to the people who need me.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to settle that. Once we get to the place where we don't have to take ownership and bear the responsibility of like, oh, well, if that person believes that, then somehow I've been unfaithful and that's going to say something about me. Then we can actually like just journey alongside of them. I had a young adult in my last church. Right when I got there, he was not attending, had not been attending for several years. And his parents, got to talking to him about me and my sermons, and he listened a little bit. And I reached out to him and asked him, if we could go, get bubble tea. And we sat, and he told me, I have all these questions. I'm going through this deconstruction, I have all these doubts. I can't continue to, teach. He'd been involved in teaching the youth class and all these different things. And I just can't do it because I have all these questions. And I was like, man, I totally get it. I was like, I've been there. So I told him a little bit about my story. And I told him, I was like, listen, this is normal. This is natural. This is okay. Right? Like, it's okay for you to ask these questions. It's okay for you to go through this process. Don't let the fact that you're having these questions speak more about you than is true. Right? Like you're asking these questions because you are a spiritual person. If you were not a spiritual person, if you were not a Christian, if you did not see anything of value in the way you were raised, then you wouldn't need to ask these questions because you could just dismiss it. The reason you have to ask these questions is because you do see value in the faith that's been delivered to you, but you want it to be your own. And that is the path that everyone has to walk. We all have to take ownership of it for ourselves. And so, do that, man. Take the time you need to take. I won't ask you to serve. I won't try to get you in. I just want you to know that I'm here, and you can call me anytime, and you take the time that you need. And you know, by the time my time in that church was done, he was back involved in the church, attending regularly. Had come to a place where he had been able to make that transition, to take ownership of his faith, to reconcile, a lot of those pressing doubts,
Mhm.
and to reconstruct his faith into something that was living and vital to him. And it's because
Mhm.
I just honored his journey, right? I let him be on the path that he's on, and I trusted God to be God.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah. You kind of just said something that want to pivot. Or almost done, but I kind of want to look at this here, man, because you know all of us are on a journey, and I think sometimes one challenge that we have is it's like, okay, we are you're out where you are, I'm where I'm at, but we're both heading to New York. And in order to get to New York, we have a connection that's in Atlanta, and another one that's going to be in DC. When we get to Atlanta, there's some people we're gonna hop on the plane, and then when we get to DC, there are some people who are gonna hop on the plane to DC. But we're all trying to get to New York, right?
Mhm.
The challenge with the journey sometimes that I see is we want everybody to start where we are.
Mhm.
And even when we talk about on the plane, we want everybody to be sitting in the same row in the same seat, but everybody can't hold in
Mhm.
the same row and everybody can't fit in the
Right.
same seat. Is what I'm saying. Some people need to be
Mhm.
at the front, some people need to be at the back for different reasons, blah blah blah. But I like the idea though of you know creating that space where we can journey together. And as you were talking, I was kind of looking at the experience of, I mean, Thomas. Thomas was one of those disciples that whenever we talk about Thomas, we use this word, doubting Thomas, right?
Mhm.
That's that's the word we use,
Yep.
doubting Thomas. And I always look at it and I'm like, but why do we call him doubting Thomas? There are moments, I mean, Jesus alluded to some things, but also the idea of Thomas's experience is okay. I hear what you're saying, but I'm trying to make it make sense to me.
Mhm.
And I feel like that is where we have to get to as we talk about you know pastoring and leading people and even dealing with our own seasons of questions. The way I see it is if you never have a question about your faith at all, I'm concerned.
Mhm.
I am really concerned because it is the questions that allow the growth process of searching and seeking God, guided by the Holy Spirit to reveal more, so that we can
Mhm.
learn. But my I guess the greater challenge I have is looking at how the pastoral experience inserts by nature either the possibility or the reality of deconstruction. You talk about you're dealing with stuff like compassion
Mhm.
fatigue, you're dealing with people's emotions, you're dealing
Mhm.
with loss and grief, and you're dealing with tension. I'm kind of wondering to myself how the realities of pastoral ministry can actually, push a pastor to a place where he or she begins to deconstruct because of the various issues that he or she has to deal with in the pastoral context. And then it brings me to this question here: is it appropriate for a pastor who's going through deconstruction to say, what, I need a break?
Mhm.
Or when does a pastor who's deconstructing get to the place where he or she says, I need a break?
Mm. Yeah. I guess one question, just for clarity's sake. So when you talk about the realities of being a pastor, and that pushing a pastor into deconstruction,
Hmm.
in your thinking, is that entering into deconstruction is a negative consequence of the difficulties of pastoral ministry. Is that,
No, no,
is
no.
that how you're
More,
framing that, or
more so the realities of pastoral ministry. They insert questions.
okay, yeah,
Right. They insert
yeah,
questions just by virtue of the
yeah,
experiences as they're happening. Hmm.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the good deconstructionist answer to that is every person's got to decide that for themselves.
Mm,
As as the I have shed most of my company hat mentality, but from a organizational perspective, if you are unable to not attack the organization that you are part of
hmm.
in your capacity as part of that organization, I think that's kind of a moral ethical line there, that if you are in a place where you feel like, in order for me to be faithful to my journey, I must begin to speak out and undermine the organization itself, then you probably need to
Take a break.
take a break. Yeah.
Mm,
um you know and but even in that, I think that there's a question, because I walk that line sometimes when I challenge structural norms within our organization, in my local church context and things. And I had an elder come to me a few weeks ago and said, you were talking at board meeting the other night, like, I felt like you were kind of getting really close to this line, and I think you need to watch that. I don't want you to, like, I understand what you're saying, but I feel like you're putting yourself in a tight spot if you continue to talk like that. And I received that, like, I heard that, right? Because and I agree with them. I did do that thing. And so, but it wasn't from a place of me trying to tear down the organization. It wasn't from a place of trying to disassociate anyone from it. It was from a place of trying to, create a different lens for our church leadership to view
hmm.
our relationship with the conference and the organization. And so one person could look at that and go, well, I made the comment that I made, and so therefore I'm attacking the organization.
Hmm.
Um, and so I should take my own advice and I should step down. Um, and so that comes down to intent, right? Like, my desire is to see my church, my local church, and then in the broader context, the church that I'm part of as a denomination, to grow in its efficiency, its efficacy, and fulfilling its mission, which is to take the gospel into all the world.
Hmm.
And so, as long as that is still a desire in my heart for me, then I'm good. But the minute I start getting to a place where I no longer want to seek the good of my local church, or I want to seek the good of our organization for the sake of the gospel going into all the world, then that's going to be the line for me. And once
Yeah.
I can no longer do that, that's going to be the place where I would say, okay, I gotta stop.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's going to be different for everyone. Someone who is very who has been very um, dogmatic in their understanding, and because I came through that side of the church, that very conservative, self-supporting, independent ministry side of the church, that was where my early discipleship happened, was in that context. I know a lot of people who, the minute they started questioning, even the slightest thing, they felt like they had to leave ministry. They felt like they had to leave the church. Like, they felt like, because that's what they were told. It's like, oh, if you don't believe everything we believe exactly the way we say we believe it, then you're not one of us. Get out. Right.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I had said that, I had taught that, I had talked to people like that. And I had to wrestle with that myself, that, like, oh, wait, I used to say this to people, and now here I am asking these questions, and I used to tell people, get out. Right. But now I know that, like, so sometimes that presses people into making those decisions probably a little prematurely.
Hmm.
Each one has to be answerable to the leading of the Holy Spirit in their life. And even if
Powerful.
they're at a place where they think that the Spirit has left them, the Spirit is still leaving them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Leading them, not leaving them.
Yeah.
I think I'm the
Right.
Spirit's still leading them. The Spirit's still
Right.
leading them.
Right. Somebody was getting ready to cut that out.
Yep.
Oh, that was getting ready to be a reel somewhere, but yeah,
Yeah.
good catch. So let's pivot and end the conversation here.
Sure.
Deconstruction can end one or two ways.
Mhm.
You can completely deconstruct to the point where you walk away from everything that you once held on to. You're like, okay, none of this in retrospect makes sense. I'm not gonna mess with this no more, which is what we find in there's this website that I was doing some reading on. I believe it is called the Clergy Project. That's what
Mhm.
we see in the Clergy Project, where guys said, listen, yeah, looking back, I've gone through the deconstruction process, I'm done with this. But then
Mhm.
there's a other side as the end result of deconstruction, which is reconstruction or reformation or restoration,
Mhm.
whatever word you want to use, where you now everything is broken down and you say, okay, all right, it's time to rebuild. And I'm gonna rebuild as the Spirit leads me to understanding what is true from His Word and what it is that He wants me to know. My question, as far as that whole reconstruction process goes, is what can the, and I'm talking from the organizational level now,
Mhm.
what can we do to support, you know, colleagues who are having internal tension
Mhm.
without our responses being punitive and retributive and to the end of punishment? How do we, foster a supportive environment where, a brother who's trying to figure it out feels like, okay, there's somebody walking this journey with me, navigating this season with me, without me feeling like, hey, I'm kicked to the curb and I'm by myself in this thing.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, Organizationally, um, yeah, the problem with the organization is that it has a mind of its own, and that's like a whole
Mm,
thing we can't go into now. But
hmm.
so the organization is striving for something, even beyond and outside of the component parts of the individuals who make up the organization itself, the conference, the union, the division, the GC, it strives for something that will always be counter to creating a safe environment for this type of questioning
Wow.
to come into, because the organization desires to exist, right? This is going to get really meta for a minute, but the organization itself wants to exist. And if you're asking questions, that's where that lack of dogma concern comes in. Is the organization's like collectively, like, no, you can't ask these questions because this will not continue to exist if you ask those questions. So all that we can do is within the brotherhood of pastors, within the communion of the saints, within the context that we have influence and capacity for conference administrators to within their sphere of influence. I went through a very challenging time a few years ago. Was being attacked by pastors and whole churches within my conference, not my church, but other churches, other pastors, conference officials were trying to see me removed from ministry. And what ultimately helped me through that was that there were other administrators at the union level and other pastors in other conferences, other conference administrators in other conferences, who came around me and said, we're going to take care of you. Like, we're going
Mhm.
to, we're going to watch out for you. We're going to hold this space for you. We're going to create space for you to rebound from this.
All right.
And that was somewhat related to deconstruction, but not directly. But the principle is the same, is that
Right.
there may come a place where a pastor needs to step away and says, like, oh, I need to take the time to be able to figure this out for myself, and I can't do this if I have this obligation to uphold the company line in the pulpit every week. So I need to take this time. What typically will happen is there'll be a level of ostracization that happens,
Hmm.
where, oh, well, you failed in ministry, you walked away from ministry. There's all this shame and this condemnation that comes down as like, you couldn't hack it, you couldn't cut it, whatever. I think that for fellow pastors, for just the general perspective in the membership and in the leadership is to when you see someone who's going through that, if we can again step back and go, that pastor going through that crisis of faith, that says nothing about me as a member.
Mhm.
My pastor has to take a break. It says nothing about me or my
Right.
beliefs, right? It's, as a conference administrator, as a conference president, it says nothing about me if a pastor needs to take a break from ministry. It says nothing about my leadership. But here's a person who is going through a spiritual struggle, and it's
Mhm.
having the personal integrity to go, I need to create space so that I can answer these questions and honor that, like acknowledge in them, like, this was a hard decision, and this is a decision that you're undertaking because you are seeking to be faithful to Christ, right? So
Mhm.
honor that, hold that space, right? It may come to that place where that distance needs to be had, but you don't have to put shame on it. You don't have to put condemnation on it. You don't have to ostracize the person for it. Support them, encourage them, love them, and let them know that when they have come to a place where if they come to a place where they want to come back, that the door is open, right? Don't
Mhm.
slam the door
Mhm.
shut and go, well, you had questions, you can never come back,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because
Right.
that in and of itself, well, like, okay, well, that complicates the whole conversation, because now as I'm going through this, it's like, oh, I've lost everything now. Like, if you felt called to be
Right.
a pastor, that's a significant calling, and now you're trying to wrestle with questions of faith, but behind the scenes that you'll never be able to enter into that calling again, even if you do reconcile your questions, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Mhm.
by holding that space, it allows for healthy reconstruction, to be able to come back and say, hey, this is where I was at. These are the questions I had. Here's the answers I have now. Here's where I stand. And I would like to re-engage with my calling, right? Hold that
Mhm.
space for that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's basically just kind of, I don't know, the same journey that we would journeying beside the members that we would do as pastors. From an
Mm-hmm.
organizational perspective, we do the same thing for the colleagues. Um, because at some point in time we will have questions about something or something else or
Mm-hmm.
something else, and there has to be that safe space. That's why
Mm-hmm.
we're having this entire conversation. There has to be a safe space where these conversations can happen. Here is the confession of the week.
Okay.
A member once asked me something about one of our beliefs. I gave them the church's official response, but I am not sure that I believe it anymore. What do you say to that pastor?
Hmm. Um, that's a hard one. I'll just tell you how I handle that personally, because there are things, and I won't get specific here, um, so it can't be used against me in a court of law. But
Hmm.
there are beliefs that, and again, I have worked through and can affirm uh, theologically all of our beliefs. I have
Hmm.
nothing that I say I can't in good conscience believe this, but there are some doctrines in which I would not hold to what is considered to be the popular company line.
Okay.
Okay. And so if someone comes and asks me a question about this one particular, which happens often, I had a 16-year-old girl come up to me after church a few weeks ago and was like, Pastor, what about this doctrine and this and this and this? And I'm really having a hard time with making sense of this in light of these other things. And I was like, yeah, no, I get that. It's like, listen, here's where we are as a church. Here's how we got to that, this understanding that we hold as a church. This is the full development of it as I understand it. Like, this was a long conversation. Like, I gave them the historical development of the doctrine itself. Said, this is how we got here. And this is what it's meant to do. And this is how we've gotten to this place where this question that you're having is coming up. And this is where I think the challenge is with that. And here's how I have reconciled it to align with our church's beliefs and the intention of that doctrine. And they were like, wow, like that makes so much sense. Like, that just, yeah, that's exactly the things that I've been thinking about and the questions I've had, because I see all the same thing. And so just being able to have that conversation and say, yeah, no, I get the question. I've had the question. Here's how I've reconciled the question. That is how I personally handle it. And, yeah, I don't know if that helps a pastor who's coming making that confession to me, because, not everyone's going to be comfortable being that vulnerable. But,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
when I've got a 16-year-old young woman coming to me asking me this heavy theological question, I'm going to do her the honor of giving her my full heavy theological answer, because she's already
Mm-hmm.
asking the question. So me pretending like the question's not there, not valid, I don't have it, I don't know what you're
Right.
talking about, that ain't helping anything. Right.
Right. Right.
And so I've cultivated that for myself. That's not directly like whatever to the confession, but that's how I handle it personally.
Yeah.
I'd have to really
Yeah.
dig in with the pastor himself to
Mm-hmm.
understand where
Mm-hmm.
that tension's coming from, to answer that, to give some advice
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah. I kind of look at it and I think about it. Be honest, be responsible, be
Mm-hmm.
mature.
Yeah.
All things can exist within the same space. Be honest,
Mm-hmm.
be mature, be responsible. You've got other people's faith, so to speak, in your hands, but you also have your faith that you've got to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And maturity dictates that you handle both very well, so that as
Mm-hmm.
you navigate, somebody else doesn't lose their grip on reality just because you were not able to navigate properly. It's kind of one of the problems
Mm-hmm.
I have when I see people come online, not just with the Adventist church, man, but with different
Mm-hmm.
denominations, and just lash out. And I get where it comes from, because they say that the number one cause of interestingly, we didn't talk about this, but I guess this is for another conversation, but the number one cause of um deconstruction is usually hurt and trauma, which is very
Mm-hmm.
interesting. That's a
Yep.
conversation that we can look at. But it's also one of the issues I have when I see people come online and they lash out against their church, and I'm like, man, you know there is an
Mm-hmm.
amount of honesty and personal integrity where you have to determine for yourself where you are in your journey and what you
Mm-hmm.
believe, but there's also a level of maturity and responsibility that's required, so you don't mess up
Mm-hmm.
somebody else's journey while you're trying to figure out yours. so
Yep.
so that's important. When we look at the life of Jesus, I'm just kind of thinking that we see this Jesus who talks a lot about truth in terms of how we live, but he was also a very patient person where people is concerned. He would take time. We were looking at it last night in Bible study. We're looking at John 3 as we talk about the Holy Spirit, where Jesus is taking time to have this conversation with this religious leader, right? And he's not pushing him aside, but he's opening the door for honest conversation so that the leader can grow. And
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about deconstruction, it's one of the things that we can definitely look at that from the life of Jesus, and that is to create that space where people feel like they can ask the question and get answers, or if there are not clear enough answers, we can walk together until both of us can answer together, because there's the understanding that, hey, I don't know it all and you don't either. So we might as well, guided by the Holy Spirit, go on this journey and figure it out. And wherever
Mm-hmm.
that journey takes us, hey, God's going to do what God wants to do with us, right? And God's going to do with us
Mm-hmm.
what we allow Him to do with us. But we might not end up at the same place, but at least, we took the journey together. And we
Mm-hmm.
know now intelligently why we ended where we are. This has been a very, very enlightening conversation. We might need to come back to having some other kind of conversation similar. This has been very, very interesting. We've got one more thing we've got to do, Wes, before we go.
Okay.
Here on Ministry Untold, we have this thing called Ministry Rush. Ministry Rush is where we just ask you light some light
Mm-hmm.
questions about yourself and ministry. You don't get to think
Okay.
about them, you just get to answer. The first answer that comes to mind is your
Okay.
first answer, and we just keep it real. Let me
Okay.
know when you're ready and we'll start the clock and we make it happen.
All right, let's go.
All right, let's go. Question number one: long board meetings or long sermon? Which one hurts the most?
Long board meetings.
Okay, what's one church phrase you secretly wish would disappear forever?
This one's gonna get me thrown out. Happy Sabbath.
Happy Sabbath. What's somebody's gonna cut that? Somebody's gonna cut. I just know it. Somebody is gonna cut it. Okay. All right. What's the most random question somebody has ever asked you after you got done preaching a sermon?
Oh my goodness. Most random question anyone has ever asked me. Nothing's coming to mind as random.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's usually the most random thing someone said to me was I got done preaching and they were like, you were saying all this stuff and I thought it was crazy. And then I started Googling it and I was like, oh no, wait, that's all there.
I love it. Thank God for Google, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank God for Google. Okay. That moment in the sermon where you realize your sermon is going longer than expected, what do you do?
Keep going.
Keep going. I love it. What's the one potluck food that you do not trust?
Oh, any kind of mystery meat.
Somebody's gonna cut that too. I'm pretty sure.
that and the green bean casseroles. You never really sure about the green bean casseroles. It could go one of two ways, and there's very rarely a middle ground.
Oh my goodness, the green. I had Toussaint Williams on here a couple of episodes ago. He said the same thing. We gotta get rid of the casserole because we don't know what's in that casserole. I love it. I love it. I love it. Okay, here we go. If pastors had warning labels, what would yours say?
Oh, oh man. Warning. This pastor has a tendency to over-explain things.
Has a tendency to over-explain things. What's the fastest way to lose a pastor's patience?
For me, the fastest way to lose my patience is to be disrespectful towards other people.
Okay. What's one thing every pastor Googles at least once?
Where is this verse found?
Where is this verse found? Listen, I agree with that. I agree with that. I did that today. I agree with that. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay. And last one. Finish this sentence. Ministry would be easier if the church members would just
go home.
Dude, I cannot have you back on my show. I cannot.
That wasn't a good one. I mean, yeah, no. I joke all the time that the pastoral ministry would be great if it wasn't for the members. But no, it's the members that make pastoral ministry great.
Oh my goodness. I cannot have you back on this. Oh my goodness.
That might be the other thing. Warning, this pastor has a tendency to say unthoughtful things.
Yeah, we gotta get him we gotta get him a communication specialist. We gotta get him an agent, a publicist, or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to do something. But I appreciate you hanging out with us today. I appreciate you sharing in this conversation. It sure has been very intellectual. It sure has been heartfelt, and it sure has been very productive. Faith is not always experienced on a straight line. For many pastors, it includes seasons of reflection and growth and tension. But honest conversation reminds us that questions do not automatically cancel calling. Sometimes they deepen our humility, sometimes they increase compassion, and other times they strengthen our dependence on God. Ministry Untold exists because too many leaders are suffering in silence. This is a space for honesty, for confession, for awareness. If you have your own story, you can submit it anonymously at ministryuntold.com. And before you go, if you want to walk this journey with us, go ahead and subscribe so that you don't miss future episodes. Click the bell so you get notified. You can also follow Ministry Untold on Facebook and on Instagram, as well as you could follow me directly on Facebook as well as on Instagram. I hope this was honest enough for you because someone has to tell the truth. Until next time, I'm Wren Hudson. And this is Ministry Untold.